So next is Amy Krosch, who is assistant professor of social psychology in our psychology department. Her undergraduate work is in psychology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. From there, she spent several years at Columbia in the Center for Decision Sciences, directed by Elke Weber and Eric Johnson. The excitement there led her to get her PhD in social psychology from NYU and brought her here to us. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks. Okay, hi, thank you for having me. Really excited to present this research today. In general, my work really focuses on social and economic factors influencing intergroup decision-making, with a special emphasis on the social cognitive, perceptual mechanisms through which that operates. Today I'm going to be talking about a specific project looking at how economic scarcity alters the perception of black faces to promote discrimination. So in 2009, when I first started this work, it was the height of the economic recession, you may remember. These issues of resource scarcity were really impossible to ignore. You were seeing them in headlines everywhere. And what was especially troubling to me as someone who had just started my PhD and was interested in issues of social justice was the observation that as the economy was declining and resources were getting more scarce, the burdens of that decline seemed to be unevenly distributed. And that racial minorities seem to be suffering the consequences of recession to the greatest extent. So for example, during the last Great Recession, we saw that everybody seemed to suffer. Here you can see median household wealth decreased for everyone across racial categories, but that this decline was most severe for racial minorities. Similarly, everyone was forced to take more, or across groups, everyone was forced to take more unpaid leave and work fewer hours. But again, this effect seems to be greatest for racial minorities. And then in New York City, where I was living at the time, you saw an unemployment disparity between white and black New Yorkers before the collapse of the economy. So this is the first quarter of 2008. And then you see, as after the economy collapsed, that this disparity is quite pronounced, quite a bit more pronounced, and that black New Yorkers seem to be suffering greater consequences of the recession than white New Yorkers. So typically effects like this are explained in policy circles as having structural and institutional roots, and of course I think that they do. For example, racial minority group members are often employed in blue-collar industries, so things like manufacturing and service jobs. And these are the sectors that seem to be most vulnerable to economic duress. So there are these structural and institutional factors. But there's also some classic social psychology theorizing and some more recent research suggesting an effect of scarcity on racial disparities beyond the societal and institutional structures, so a psychological effect. For example, scarce conditions can influence people's judgments, their beliefs, their attitudes in ways that are consistent with discrimination. In my own work, I have found that merely referring to a resource as scarce on account of the economic recession and holding that amount of resource constant can lead people to discriminate against minority recipients. And so the bulk of my subsequent work on this topic of scarcity, after establishing this link between scarcity and these behavioral biases, was to try to illuminate the processes through which this is potentially operating, through which scarcity is leading to allocation biases. So in an initial set of behavioral studies, I was really interested in the idea of motivated perception and hypothesized that that scarcity might shift people's perceptions of race in discrimination-consistent ways in order to influence these disparities. And there's a lot of research. There was a lot of research as these ideas were percolating, coming out, suggesting that although race is often regarded as fixed, that actually our social goals and our motivations can shift the way that we see race and influence downstream consequences of that. And in fact, we did some work looking at this using behavioral measures to look at the effects of scarcity on people's representations of race, and found that people had darker, more stereotypically Black representations of Black people when they were in a scarce context versus a neutral context, and that led to greater downstream discrimination. Okay, but switching gears, today I'm going to be talking about a sort of lower level question and asking whether scarcity can actually alter visual processing of faces more generally, shifting the extent to which decision makers are actually encoding Black faces as faces the instant that they see them, the very first moment that the face appears to them. That is, might perceptual dehumanization, or seeing people as less face-like, mediate this relationship between scarcity and racial discrimination. So to answer this question, we employed neuroscientific tools to examine early visual face processing, or that first moment when people saw a face as a face. And I'm going to be glossing over a lot of methodological details because this is a short talk. So ask me questions afterwards. I'm happy to answer them all. Okay. So in the first study, we investigated this effect of scarcity on face processing using EEG. So we recorded the electricity coming off of people's scalps as they performed an allocation task. Again, I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail, but we specifically looked at electrical activity occurring at 170 milliseconds, being generated from this occipital region, temporal occipital region, and that's thought to be underpinned, at least in part, by the face-sensitive fusiform gyrus, which I will get to in the second study. But in any case, all you need to know for now about this measure that we were using is it occurs at about 170 milliseconds. So this is very early face processing. It's thought to reflect this early configural processing of faces. So the first moment a face is holistically seen as a face in your percept. And importantly, when this type of face processing is disrupted, we see a delay in this N170. So that's what we're going to be looking for in these studies. Okay, so in the first study using EEG, we brought participants into the lab. These were non-Black participants. We had them play a resource allocation game. We told them there were two possible roles. They could be an allocator, in which case they would be dividing resources, deciding how much to give a partner. They could also be a recipient, in which case they would just be receiving the payout. And we led them to believe they would be randomly assigned. But in fact, all of our participants were in the role of the allocator to put them in this mindset of having these resources, being able to make these decisions, having that agency. Okay, so next we manipulated scarcity. We told participants that the computer was going to be randomly selecting the amount of money they would have to play with in this game. And half of our subjects were told they could have up to $10 to play with in this game, and then they ostensibly, or they saw the computer ostensibly randomly select $10. So half of our subjects believed they got the full 10 out of 10 amount. The other half of our subjects were were told they could have up to $100 to allocate in this task, and then randomly or ostensibly randomly saw the computer select $10. So critically, all of our participants thought that they had $10 to allocate in this experiment. It's just the potential amount that they could have had that differs between these two conditions. And we've pre-tested this pretty frequently, and we can talk about the differences that this causes, but overwhelmingly, people in this condition experience $10 as being more scarce, being more valuable, and yeah, more scarce. That's the critical component. Okay, so all of our participants thought they had 10. Some of them thought they had 10 out of 10 or 10 out of 100. Okay, so next they completed this behavioral task. Participants were told they were going to see a number of faces, and it was their job to indicate how much they wanted to allocate to each person. That these people were photographed photographed participants from previous studies, and that one person was going to be randomly selected from the database to be paid out for real. They simply saw the face, made an indication, went on to the next trial, and we recorded EEG throughout this. So indeed, we found a clear pattern of interaction that we expected of scarcity and race on this N170 latency. So here you can see in the control condition, where participants got the full 10 out of 10, they're not showing any differences between white and black faces as they're making these decisions. However, in the scarce condition, you see that black faces are showing this longer N170 latency, suggesting that face processing is being disrupted in some way by scarcity when they're viewing black faces. So this suggests that scarcity is actually impacting this early visual processing occurring at 170 milliseconds from when the presentation of the face pops on the screen. Okay, but importantly, we care about behavior here. So we next looked at how this kind of delay could predict downstream behaviors, or the behaviors that they're making in the tasks. Downstream is, several milliseconds in this case, but downstream behaviors after they first initially see this face. And specifically, we tested a model in which scarcity predicts this N170 latency difference, this delay to black faces that I showed you in the last slide, which then predicts this white-black allocation bias. And indeed, we found a significant A-B cross product here suggesting that scarcity is influencing this behavioral allocation. So people are discriminating more against black recipients in the scarce condition, and that seems to be occurring through this dampened encoding of faces, or not processing faces as face-like. Okay. In a second study, we used fMRI to first provide convergent evidence of this. So the N170 is sort of diffuse. It's thought to be generated by multiple neural sources. So using fMRI with great spatial resolution, or better spatial resolution, we were able to really pinpoint this region of the brain that is thought to be sensitive to faces to get at this face processing, the fusiform gyrus. And then, of course, we had this incredibly rich data set with neural activity all over the brain, so we were able to answer some other questions that we had about other processes that might be involved. And specifically, we were interested in devaluation as a process through which seeing someone as less human or less face-like could cause you to devalue them, which could then lead to these behavioral consequences, give rise to this discriminatory allocation. Okay, identical task, except neuroimaging was happening now. Again, replicating study 1, we found that in the control condition, black and white faces don't differ, but that in the scarcity condition, activity in the fusiform seems to be dampened for black faces. So you're showing decreased activation in that region relative to these white faces. So again, this is suggesting that scarcity is actually impacting the visual processing of black faces. It's changing the way that we're seeing these recipients of the resources that we're giving. Okay, next we examined the relationship between activity related to face processing, like I said, and activity related to valuation. We're interested in the link between dehumanization and devaluation and how that gives rise to discrimination. So we looked at some a priori regions associated with valuation in order to really test this hypothesis that seeing someone as less face-like can lead you to devalue them, both neurally and in behavior. So as we expected, we found significant connectivity differences in the conditions between the fusiform and the striatum. So we showed that the activity related to face processing was most closely linked to activity related to valuation on these scarce black trials. So the extent to which people are seeing black faces as less face-like on scarce black trials, they're also showing less activity related to valuation. And then importantly, we were able to link the strength of this bias to their behavioral bias. So to the extent that people were showing dampened fusiform activity or dampened face processing, They were also showing greater dampened valuation, and the extent to which they were doing that was predicting how anti-Black they were in the scarcity condition. So this pattern, we think, really replicates the pattern that I showed you in the EEG study, and also extends it to suggest that these visual processing deficits under scarcity somehow involve devaluation of faces, and that's giving rise to these behavioral biases. This is a correlational study, so we would have to follow that up to prove the causal direction, but we do know that this visual processing is occurring at 170 milliseconds. It's happening really, really early on in the processing stream. Okay, so just to sum up, I think these findings are important. Of course, I ran these studies, so I think these studies are important, but because they really uncover a pretty unique mechanism through which these racial disparities that I opened with can expand under economic crisis, right? So they can help give some traction on this big societal issue. And they also really nicely dovetail with some very recent research looking at this idea of perceptual dehumanization, linking higher level concepts of dehumanization with lower level inability to process face as well, and showing that can be linked to negative behaviors. So seeing someone as less face-like, you're able to perpetrate harm against them more easily. But they also represent a challenge perhaps to discrimination reduction efforts, right? So visual biases like this are fairly difficult to detect. People are not aware of the visual biases that they have. They think that their visual perception is an accurate representation of the world. So it could be difficult because visual information is assumed to be accurate. And furthermore, given a lot of recent research looking at how scarcity undermines cognitive control, it suggests that even if people are able to detect these visual biases that they might be having, they may not have the resources to overcome them in behavior. So I think this perhaps points to the need for more proactive intervention strategies that prevent perceptual biases from occurring in the first place. That's what I'm working on right now in the lab, is trying to get people to rehumanize, even under these competitive conditions where they're not incentivized to do so. And it also points to the need, of course, for stronger institutional protections to prevent these perceptual biases from leaking into behavior. So just in conclusion, like I said, these economic crises seem to really affect most Americans, but they have especially harmful consequences for racial minorities. And by examining these social cognitive and perceptual mechanisms through which scarcity seems to be exacerbating discrimination, my hope is to one day start to inform some interventions aimed at achieving racial justice in the distribution of scarce resources. So with that, thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So, I mean, it seems like you found evidence of kind of out-group devaluation and derogation, and I don't think I saw evidence of in-group, like, supervaluation. And I guess I'm wondering if you've seen evidence for that anywhere, and I'd be particularly interested in what you would predict or maybe you found among Black participants.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. We don't have the Black participants to look at that. And there is a slight boost in the fMRI study. There's no boost in the EEG study for white others, and these are majority white participants. My reading of it is that sort of pro-in-group biases prevail when there isn't this threat or this competitive element, but as soon as competition gets introduced, then it sort of switches to the anti-outgroup, the outgroup derogation from a more in-group love perspective. So I think that's what's going on here. I think that's why we're not seeing this promotion of white people perceptually. Although you could imagine that if scarcity is somehow dampening encoding for everybody, but just not dampening it as much for white people, that you could argue that there's a little bit of in-group love going on too, but those aren't significantly different. Yeah, Katie.
I was wondering if you could say more about your scarcity prime. And so in your view, is a scarcity prime the same as or different from a loss prime?
Yeah.
And then I guess I'm also just wondering about the specificity of scarcity. You know, what if you put people in a bad mood through other means? Like what if you took a bogus intelligence task and it turns out they're not so smart? Would you see something similar or would you not?
Yeah, I mean, great questions. Like we're really trying to pin down what scarcity is in general and also what this manipulation is doing. So things this manipulation is not doing, it doesn't seem to be interfering too much with control, so people don't seem to show big deficits on a Stroop task afterwards. It does seem to be really bumping up their social dominance orientation, so you're able to push that around. So I really think about it as inducing a sense of competition between groups. We also show that this manipulation alters people's perception that resources are a zero-sum game between different racial group members. So definitely there's something groupy going on there, but I think there are perhaps complementary processes that could also be bolstering this. We don't have any evidence that I have not looked to see if it is shifting mood, but we have also used a number of scarcity manipulations, not for the very expensive neuroimaging stuff, but in behavioral tasks. Oh, and also people's individual differences on the measure asking them how scarce does the $10 feel to you is predictive of these effects on the individual difference level. So I feel confident it's a scarcity induction, but I think there are other things that could be going on there psychologically too.
So I'm sure there are more questions.
Sorry.
Given the time, can I ask that the questions be done privately to Amy when we're finished? All right, thanks again, Amy.